It was one of those January nights that get into your bones, the parking lot lamps buzzing over frost-slick asphalt when I spotted a beat-up blue sedan with its hood up and a man in a worn leather jacket staring down an engine like it had insulted him. I set my grocery bags on my trunk and walked over, asked if he needed a hand, and he said it cranked but wouldn't catch, so I leaned in. Saw the loose battery clamp and a tired ground strap, asked him to turn the key, and while the starter complained, I snugged the clamp with a 10mm he fished from a roll-up tool kit, scuffed the contact with a scrap of sandpaper I keep for stubborn jobs, and said, "Again." And this time the engine coughed, caught, and settled into a steady idle. He laughed the way people do when relief ambushes them, stuck out his hand, said, "Ryan." And I said, "Mark." And when he asked how to pay me back, I told him it wasn't necessary, but he tore a page from a pocket notebook, scribbled his number, and pressed it into my palm. "In case you ever need a rescue." So I flipped an old business card, wrote my cell on the back, and said, "Fair trade." And we stood there a beat in that pleasant cold where strangers might be friends in another life before we went our separate ways. I slid his number into a drawer when I got home and didn't think about it again, until 6 years later, when fate decided to call it in point. 6 years later, the sound of sirens was tearing through the night when I ran toward the intersection, my chest already tight before I even saw the wreck. A silver compact lay crumpled around a light pole, steam curling from the mangled hood, glass glittering across the wet asphalt. People stood in a loose ring, murmuring, their faces lit by the strobes of emergency lights. I pushed through, my hands trembling, and saw my son, 17, barely more than a year into his license, slumped against the seatbelt, his eyes half open but glassy. A nurse in scrubs knelt by the front fender, keeping his head still, but the driver's door was bent in like a clenched fist. Then, from behind me, a voice cut through the noise. "I need space." The crowd parted almost without thinking, and a man moved in with a calm, deliberate stride. I didn't recognize him at first. 6 years is enough time to change a face, and the leather jacket was gone. But there was something about the way he took in the scene, assessing, deciding, acting, that scratched at the edge of my memory. He crouched, glanced through the shattered side window. "He's breathing, but we need to get him out now," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The nurse shook her head. "We wait for EMS. We don't have that kind of time," he interrupted, eyes darting to the faint electrical crackle under the dash. Someone handed him a tire iron, and he drove it into the gap by the hinge, muscles straining as the metal screamed in protest. "Ignition off," he ordered without looking up. It took me a beat to realize he meant me. I reached through the rear window, careful not to jostle my son's head, and turned the key until the dash went dark. A teenager in a hoodie appeared with a crowbar, and the man swapped tools in a fluid motion, levering the frame until it gave another inch. "Knife," he said, and the kid handed him a box cutter. One clean slice and the seatbelt snapped free. "On my count, tilt the seat back 2 inches, stabilize the spine, and slide him onto coats." Around us, people stripped off jackets without a word, laying them in a padded runway on the ground. 3. The movement was painfully slow, careful hands measured inches, but my son made a small sound, and I heard the man's voice drop, steady and warm. "You're all right, buddy." Big breath. "That's it." The smell of fuel hit the air just as they eased him onto the coats. Firefighters were arriving now, hoses and foam ready, EMTs moving in with a practiced urgency. My son was alive. Breathing. Out. I looked up to thank the man, and that's when recognition hit like a punch. The parking lot, the winter night, the battery clamp. "Ryan," I said, and his mouth curved in the ghost of a smile. "Told you I owed you one," he replied. And before I could say anything more, the EMTs had my son on a stretcher, and Ryan was stepping back toward the edge of the crowd. The hospital room was dim except for the green glow of the monitors, the soft beep-beep marking each steady heartbeat. My son was sleeping, the color slowly returning to his face, but I couldn't stop replaying the scene. The sound of twisting metal, the smell of gasoline, and Ryan's voice cutting through the chaos like it had somewhere to be. He'd vanished before I could say more than his name. By the time the night was over, I was half convinced I wouldn't hear from him again. The next afternoon, my phone lit up with an unknown number. "Mark? It's Ryan." I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my shoulders until they loosened at the sound of his voice. "I just wanted to know how the kid's doing." "He's stable," I said. "Doctors think it's mostly bruises and a mild concussion." "We're lucky." "That's good," he replied, his tone carrying a quiet relief. There was a pause, the kind where you can tell someone is thinking about what to say next. "I should have stuck around last night," he said. "But, well, I'm not great with crowds." "You don't need to explain," I told him. "But I owe you. At least let me buy you coffee sometime." Another pause. "All right. Tomorrow?" We met at a small diner on the corner of Maple and Fifth, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who knew everyone's order before they sat down. He was already there, a half-empty mug in front of him, the steam curling lazily toward the ceiling. We shook hands, firm, familiar, and it was like the 6 years since that parking lot had been a week. We talked for hours. About the accident, yes, but also about work, the city, the changes we'd seen since we were younger. He told me about the years between, stints in mechanics shops, some private security work, a little traveling when he could afford it. He had a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard more than once, and I found myself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in weeks. When the waitress topped off our cups for the third time, Ryan glanced at the window like he'd stayed longer than he'd meant to. "You ever need a hand with anything, home repairs, car trouble, whatever, call me," he said. "Consider it interest on a debt I can't pay off." I told him I'd take him up on that, and I did. 2 weeks later, my water heater started leaking. I called him, half expecting he'd be busy. He showed up an hour later with a toolbox, fixed the leak in 20 minutes, and stayed for dinner. My son was there, moving slowly but healing, and the way Ryan spoke to him, not with pity, but like he was just another guy at the table, struck me. He didn't hover, didn't ask about the crash unless my son brought it up. From there, it just happened. He dropped by to watch a game, help fix the deck, or teach my son how to change brake pads in the driveway. Sometimes he'd call me just to talk about a weird noise his car was making or a new burger place he'd found. It was easy, natural, the kind of friendship that doesn't need defining to be understood. It didn't take long before seeing Ryan around the house felt as normal as the morning coffee. At first it was practical, a hand with the fence after a windstorm, a ride for my son when my work ran late, someone to hold the ladder while I cleared the gutters. But somewhere along the way, the practical turned into comfortable. He didn't wait for an invitation anymore. He'd just show up at the end of my driveway, leaning against his truck with a small wave, like he'd always been part of the picture. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of laughter outside. I stepped onto the porch to see Ryan and my son bent over the open hood of the old Chevy, arguing, in good humor, about whether the squeal was from the belt or the pulley. Ryan had grease on his hands, and my son had that look of someone learning without realizing it. They spent half the day in the driveway, and when they finally came in, Ryan gave a mock bow. "The student is officially qualified to handle basic roadside emergencies," he announced, and my son grinned like he'd been handed a medal. There were smaller moments, too. One rainy afternoon, the three of us got stuck inside and ended up watching old westerns. My son sprawled on the couch, Ryan sat in the armchair, and I realized we'd been trading sarcastic commentary at the screen for over an hour without even noticing the time pass. Another evening, Ryan showed up with a toolbox just because I'd mentioned offhand the garage door opener was sticking. He fixed it, then stayed for dinner. By dessert, my son was challenging him to a basketball game in the driveway, even though it was dark and misty. Ryan played barefoot, missed on purpose once or twice, but still managed to sink the winning shot and grinned like a kid himself. By summer, Ryan was part of our weekends more often than not. He came with us to the farmer's market, carrying bags and making quiet jokes about the prices. He joined us for barbecues, showing my son how to season meat like he'd been doing it for years. On a spur-of-the-moment trip to the next town's fair, he rode the Ferris wheel with my son while I held their jackets, and when they got off, Both of them were laughing so hard they could barely walk straight. It was subtle, but I could see the effect he had on my son. After the accident, there'd been a shadow there, a kind of watchfulness, like he was waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Ryan didn't push him to talk about it, but he was there, steady, reliable, giving him space when he needed it and company when he didn't know he wanted it. One night, after a long day repairing part of the deck, we sat out back with a couple of beers while my son was inside finishing homework. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and cedar. Ryan leaned back in his chair, looking out toward the dark yard. "You know," he said quietly, "I didn't realize how much I missed this. Not just the work, just having a place to be. People who notice if you don't show up." I didn't say much, just nodded, but I knew exactly what he meant. From then on, it wasn't unusual for my son to text Ryan directly, about car trouble, about a game, about some funny video he'd seen. And it wasn't unusual for Ryan to stop by just to drop something off, or because he happened to be in the neighborhood, even if that meant a detour across town. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped thinking of him as the guy who saved my son's life, and started thinking of him as just Ryan, our friend, part of the family whether he'd meant to be or not. Autumn rolled in with cool mornings and trees burning gold and crimson, and by then Ryan's presence in our lives was so woven in that I'd catch myself setting out an extra coffee mug in the morning without even checking if he was coming by. Friday nights often meant high school football games under the stadium lights, my son on the field, me in the bleachers, and Ryan right beside me, hands in his jacket pockets, calling plays under his breath like he'd been doing it for years. He didn't just watch, he paid attention. After the games, my son would meet us at the fence, still sweaty from the field, and they'd go over plays like they were teammates instead of a teenager and a man in his 40s. Saturdays were for projects. One weekend we rebuilt the old shed door, and Ryan took the time to teach my son how to measure and cut the boards, showing him tricks my father used to teach me. Another Saturday, we replaced a section of gutter that had been hanging loose since spring. Ryan worked steadily, but he made it fun, tossing out dry one-liners, turning the latter work into a kind of competition. My son always rose to the challenge, grinning when Ryan gave him a rare "Not bad, kid." There were moments outside of chores, too. One crisp afternoon, we drove to a nearby lake just to walk the trail and watch the leaves drift across the water. My son went ahead with a camera, and Ryan and I hung back, talking about nothing in particular: work, weather, the way the seasons seemed shorter every year. It was easy, that conversation, the kind that just drifts along without effort. The holidays started early that year. We put up lights the weekend after Thanksgiving, and Ryan was there, climbing the ladder with my son to wrap the eaves while I untangled cords below. When the lights finally blinked on, my son stood with his arms crossed, pretending to judge the work, and Ryan nudged him with an elbow. "Not bad for amateurs," he said, and they both laughed. By December, my son's confidence behind the wheel had returned, but winter driving was still new territory. One snowy afternoon, Ryan took him to the empty lot behind the rec center to practice handling skids. I watched from the sidelines as he coached him through turns, showing him how to correct without overreacting. My son spun out once, twice, each time recovering a little faster, and by the end of the hour, his grin was wide and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen since before the accident. It was around that time I started thinking about making it official, about asking Ryan to be my son's godfather. He'd already earned the title in every way that mattered, but I wanted to say it out loud, to acknowledge what he'd given us. I carried the thought for weeks, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on my son's 18th birthday. The party had wound down, the last of his friends had gone home, and the three of us were in the living room with leftover cake and the TV murmuring in the background. My son was leaning back in his chair, looking as content as I'd ever seen him, and Ryan was beside him, relaxed, smiling faintly at something on the screen. I took a breath. "You've been here for us in ways I'll never be able to repay," I said, looking at Ryan. "You've shown up, taught, listened, been a friend to me and a role model to him. So I want to ask, would you be his godfather?" For a second, Ryan didn't say anything. Then he smiled, small, steady, the kind of smile you feel more than see. "I'd be honored," he said. My son didn't hesitate. He got up, crossed the room, and hugged him. It was a long, fierce hug, and I knew in that moment the question had been answered long before I'd asked it out. We made it official a month later. It wasn't a big, orchestrated event, no tuxedos or rented halls, just a small ceremony at the old brick church at the edge of town, the same one my parents had gone to when I was a kid. The pews smelled faintly of pine polish, the air warm despite the February chill outside. A few close friends came, along with family who'd heard about Ryan's part in our story more than once over holiday dinners. My son stood between us at the front, taller than he'd been the night of the accident, the faint scar on his forehead a reminder of just how close we'd come to a very different ending. The pastor spoke briefly about community and the families we choose, and then it was simple, a promise, a hand on the shoulder, Ryan's voice low but certain as he accepted the role. There were no grand speeches, but when I looked over, I saw his eyes shine for a second before he blinked it away. My son grinned, then pulled him into a hug that made everyone smile, even the pastor. Afterward, we went back to my place. I'd cooked too much food, and someone had brought a cake with "Welcome to the family," piped in shaky icing across the top. The kitchen was loud with laughter, the kind of noise that feels like warmth even when you're not part of the joke. At one point, I stepped back into the doorway and just watched Ryan sitting at the table with my son, the two of them bent over some half-finished card game, teasing each other like brothers. That was when it truly sank in. This wasn't just about gratitude anymore. Somewhere between a cold night in a parking lot and a wrecked car on a wet street, we'd become something solid, something lasting. In the weeks after, life slipped back into its usual rhythm, but there was an ease to it now. Ryan had a key to the house. My son would call him for advice about cars, jobs, even classes. I'd get texts from Ryan with photos of them at a diner after a late game, both of them grinning like conspirators. And every time I saw that, I thought about how easily we could have missed each other altogether, how a small act of kindness years ago had started a chain of events that gave my son a second chance at life and gave me a friend I hadn't known I needed. Some debts can't be paid back, they can only be paid forward. And some people don't just come into your life, they settle into it, like they were always supposed to be there. So now I want to ask you, how did you meet your best friend as an adult?